On France's National Day, the country put on a show of energy and electronica, with a leader who gets the pop culture references and is up for a game of who can hold a handshake the longest. It was a display of Gallic public relations for all the world to see. But when it comes to domestic popularity, President Emmanuel Macron hasn't been so lucky with his performance. He's only been in office for 100 days, but his personal approval rating stands at only 36%. That's even lower than it was for his deeply unpopular predecessor, François Hollande. Macron swept into office with En Marche, the new party he founded just over a year ago, promising change and political renewal. He secured 65% of the vote and defeated the far-right candidate Marine Le Pen.
Je vous servirai au nom de notre devise liberté, égalité, fraternité.
Macron has vowed to walk a centrist path instead of veering to the left or the right like previous presidents. His mission includes an ambitious plan to reform the economy through tax cuts, a major shake-up of labour laws, and cutting up to 120,000 public sector jobs over the next 5 years.
Jusqu'ici, trop souvent, nous avons fait fausse route. Nous avons préféré les procédures aux résultats, le règlement à l'initiative, la société de la rente à la société de la justice. Et je crois profondément que par ces choix récents, notre peuple nous demande d'emprunter une voie radicalement nouvelle.
But slashing spending has already led to a backlash against his leadership. The military chief, General Pierre de Villiers, resigned in protest over defence budget cuts. And the president has also come under fire for plans to create an American-style office for the First Lady, Brigitte Macron. More than 300,000 people have signed a petition against the move. But his biggest test is on the horizon, after the summer holidays. That's when Macron is expected to pass a decree to change the labour code to radically alter the workplace, including making it easier for bosses to hire and fire staff. French unions and citizens are renowned for their ability to protest and strike, and previous attempts to change working conditions have failed. Macron has shown he's not afraid of criticism, but will he be able to stay the course if it means becoming an even more unpopular president? Natalie Pohonen, The Newsmakers.
Well, to talk more about Macron's standing and what's to come going forward, I'm joined from l'Île-de-France by Anne Le Breton. She is the deputy mayor of Paris's 4th district. From the capital, Paris, Alyssa Rubin. She's the Paris bureau chief for the New York Times. And from Washington, D.C., Jeff Lightfoot. He is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Thanks all so much for joining us. Alyssa, let me start with you. Given the French public's often very fickle support for their politicians, especially over the last 15 years, did Macron ever really stand a chance?
Well, I would say we won't know, actually. I would say he still stands a chance.
Even given the lowest popularity ratings?
I mean, at the moment, yes, I actually really do believe that if he can deliver on the economy, that's an enormous benefit for France. No one has managed to do that in the past. You know, neither Mr. Sarkozy, who was on the right, nor Mr. Hollande on the left. Jacques Chirac himself retreated from some of the reforms. So I actually think that if there is a real change and there are more jobs especially for young people, that will make a great difference. But balanced against that, I think we have to remember that in in the primaries, or not primaries, but the first round of the general election, Macron got about 24% of the vote. That's not a huge, that's 1 in 4 people who voted, and Marine Le Pen didn't do so much worse. So it was a very divided field, and I think the French are very divided about what they want.
Okay, Jeff, let me ask you, do you think Macron can turn his fortunes around?
I think he has an uphill climb,
Yes,
and one of the reasons I think that is
but
because
Hold on, Alyssa, I'm letting Jeff grab this one.
Sorry.
Well, I actually agree with Anna. I think he can, but I do think it's an uphill climb, in part because he doesn't have that party base. I mean, his political party, La République En Marche, is a new movement. So he's outside of the traditional party structures, and I think that's allowed his popularity to fall a little bit. And as Anne mentioned, he is quite divided. These labor reforms will be a good thing for France if he can get them through, but they certainly won't be popular. And so he may be a politician who does the right thing, but finds himself with a rather low popularity rating. But what works in his favor, I think, is that the political opposition is decimated. So Macron's popularity numbers aren't very good, but it's not as if the opposition necessarily has very strong numbers either. So there really isn't much of an alternative to Macron right now for France. And I think because of that, he still has a chance to turn his fortunes around.
Okay, Anne, I imagine you're at least on the same page there. You do believe in him. He gave hope over the course of his campaign. You still think that hope is alive? How do you expect him to tangibly change things in France for the better?
Well, I agree very much that there's a misunderstanding about the polls, because in France now, we're not in a situation where there are 2 parties. We're really in a situation where there are 4 blocs. And we won, in the first round by 25%. So it's not especially surprising that we're around that, our polls are the way they are now. What's going to count is what we're able to achieve in September. People are really expecting change. And so it's going to be all about what we can do. And we were elected on a very much of a reformist program. And if we can deliver on reform, I think that naturally the polls will turn around. We shouldn't worry too much about that for the moment.
Alyssa, then let me ask you, all 3 of you have expressed some hope going forward. Then what up until now was his biggest mistake? What do you think really drove those poll ratings down?
Well, I think what we felt watching him, and I'm speaking when I say we, I'm just thinking here journalistically, sort of from an attempt to be as nonpartisan as possible. He often spoke in really very abstract terms, and he wasn't very concrete about what exactly he was going to do, for instance, in the labor law. So everyone, my sense is, imagines their worst nightmare scenario rather than what might actually be the result of all the deal making that's going on right now. And Macron is not completely tone deaf, and he recognizes that if you do something so that hurts too many people, it will reverberate throughout the society, even if, in fact, you might end up with some real gains as a result. So I do have some hope that he will be sensitive to that. And my reason for that is that we've seen at least some of the labor unions make, if not conciliatory noises, not outright opposition. The strongest certainly have been threatened strikes. I think the first is either on the 9th or the 12th of September. But I still think that it will really depend if it's all of labor and if it's all of young people. But and so I think he did himself a bit of a disservice by not being as specific as he could have been.
But Alyssa, what about the much publicized falling out with the military, as well as his position on making his wife a formal French First Lady, creating that office, even after he criticized nepotism in French politics?
Right. I think he has a lot to learn about being a leader and of seeing how an ordinary person will look at what he's doing. Both of those were real missteps, and that's why I say he can be, you know, he's not completely tone deaf, but he is a bit tone deaf, and that's why, you know, I wrote about both of those incidents because they were striking. And in general, the military has very wide support in France. It's seen as nonpartisan, as serving the Republic before it serves any individual party or leader. And I'm not sure really why that was necessary. I think it could have been handled in many other ways. As for the situation with his wife, I think again, he really suffered from not being clear. If you read the petition that did so well on the internet, it sort of made a reference to her the spouse being paid, and that was not part of Macron's proposal to begin with. That was what he wanted was to somehow give her some sort of title that reflected, or some sort of position that would really explain what she did.
Okay.
Because otherwise she'll just go ahead and do it anyway,
Right.
but without that.
And what do you think? Were those missteps that perhaps he regrets, or do you think he was right on in making those calls? Maybe they were tougher calls for him to make, but he did the right thing by the military and by trying to create a first lady for France?
I think the question of the First Lady for France was really not something very important for him or for the French. And it's the paradox is that whenever she's on the papers, they sell like, you know, so she's very popular in a way. But it's true, French people have always had a distrust of putting families, you know, they like seeing them, but they don't want them officially, you know, in the picture. So that was, and it was not something very important at all in the program, and so that's just going to be blown over in a few minutes. What happened with the military is very different, and I personally have met people from the military who thought there was, you know, a lot more good than you can think in that crisis, that what had been coming from a long way back, it's not just something that happened in 2 days, you know, in a clash between two people. So they maybe, you know, some people within the military think maybe there was a good idea to, you know, show who does what. And it is important that the president can, you know, has his way. He's the head of the army. And so, you know, I don't know if it was so much of a crisis that could have been avoided, and things are going to stand in a much clearer way from now on.
Okay, Jeff, I saw you nodding your head in agreement at one point there.
Yeah, if I may, what I think is important about the dispute that he had with the military was in part because it pits two of his big strategic priorities and two of France's strategic priorities against each other. One is that the country has to reduce its expenses to get below the EU mandated 3% of GDP for the annual deficit. That's the number one thing that and labor reform are really the top things that Macron was trying to achieve while the country is at war. And it's pretty clear that the military needs about, as I understand it, about 2 billion euros a year in extra expenses to really replenish equipment that's been degraded in operations in Africa, to increase training because a lot of troops are out in Paris and in other French cities to protect important sites. And so this is a country that's at war, a military that's under great duress and feels it's at a breaking point. And so Macron had to make a choice. And he had to choose the economy, even though he promised later to increase the defense expenditure. So I think that was an important moment because it showed that austerity is going to rule the day, I think, under this administration, because there really isn't much of a choice for Macron at this point.
Austerity, yeah, could be key, and that is very unlikely to gain him more points in the polls, unfortunately. Jeff, let me ask you then, does he need popular support now to go forward with changing labor laws and enacting tax reform, or should he just barrel forward and do this regardless of how unpopular it may be?
Well, structurally, he has a substantial majority in the parliament of the La République En Marche, and really, the question is, will they stay aligned with him? These are in many cases, new politicians who don't have a lot of experience and are still learning how to even govern in the National Assembly. So structurally, he's got the support that he needs to enact the legislation. He's got the ordinances are set so he can do the labor reform law by decree. But the question is, if a lot of people in France feel like they didn't have an option, a credible option last May in the voting because it was a choice between the center and the far right, will they express themselves in the streets? And sometimes that's more powerful than the National Assembly. But I think he has to proceed. I think he knows, is very clear about what the challenges are facing France. I don't think you could say that about his predecessor. And so I expect Macron, I think he's a little stubborn, and I expect him to proceed and take some difficult choices because I think he knows that this is a now or never moment for France.
Alyssa, I see you slightly nodding at agreement there. Do you think he will be able to push through these most difficult labor and tax reforms?
Well, I agree with Jeff that, you know, he's basically helped the current majority in the parliament get there. They ran on his, as members of his party or members of a closely allied party, the moderate, Mouvement Démocratique. And so they in a sense owe him something, and they've already voted for the ordonnance. It's not like the American or system where there'll be a chance for amendment. He will present it, and people will, and it will go into effect, as Jeff said, by decree. I do think the difficulty is how much people take to the streets, in how many cities that happens, and whether it requires violent action by the police to stop them and to get the country back to work. And I do, you know, that has been what has defeated some of these efforts in the past, and I don't know how much stomach Macron will have for confronting people if there is that kind of outpouring. I think this will be the real test. Do the French want change? Do they want the risks that always come with economic change? Or do they really not want to take those risks right now? And I'm waiting with bated breath.
Yeah, and how are you feeling about that going forward? The French public's response might be tough. They might take to the streets. There might be clashes with police. Is Macron ready for that when he tries to build these labor reforms and change tax law?
Well, I'm not, we'll have to wait until September, but I'm not even sure the French are ready to take to the streets, because the only part of France's opposition that is ready to do that is the extreme left, which is a quarter. You know, when I said we were 4 quarters in the first round of the presidential election, it's only 1/4 of those French people who are ready to do that. I don't think they're quite organized enough. I'm not sure it's even going to happen. And of course, you know, nobody likes to go for reform with everybody in the street. So that's going to be the big test of September. And the extreme left knows it, and they're getting ready for it. But so are we. We were elected very much with a reform program. We have a large majority in the parliament, and the people voted for us in the parliament. They had a choice. It wasn't only voting against Marine Le Pen. For the parliamentary elections, people really gave us a clear mandate. So of course we can push in all those reforms, and of course nobody likes to push in reforms against the street. But will we be able to convince the street, you know, to go with us for the reform? People know deep down inside them in France that we need to change a lot of things. And I think that even though we are low in the polls, the idea of reform is something that French people have started to be convinced about.
Okay, Anne, I'm going to leave it there with you, and I think that's an interesting thought to leave on, because I really haven't heard that before. We're so accustomed to seeing the French really combat reform, especially in their economy. There usually are people taking to the streets whenever the government attempts to enact this kind of labor law change and tax reform. So I hope you're right. I hope France can remain stable and see its way through it. But unfortunately, we're out of time. I'd like to thank all three of you so much for joining us on this edition of the Newsmakers. Take care.